Hello! Today we're going to be looking at the levels of government. And although the video is particular to Canada, much of what I'm going to say is applicable to a lot of other countries. So let's get into it. We have the federal level of government, which is parallel to the provincial level of government. And this is where things I've changed a little. Generally, we would have the municipal government up here, parallel to the provincial government. But I think these changes, having the Aboriginal self-government agreements and the municipalities down here, more accurately represents how things actually work in Canada. Generally, you would think the federal government is things of federal jurisdiction, like defense and big economic things. And generally that's true. In the provinces, we think of more things that have to do with a provincial nature. And again, that's generally true. But this is where things change a little. And I think the best way to look at that is to look at the Constitution itself, which I got right here. So I've taken this, and we have a few provisions of the Constitution that we're going to be looking at. The first one is our sections 91 over here and 92 over here of the Constitution Act of 1867. So that's Canada's birthday in 1867. It's when we formed. And we had a document called the Constitution Act of 1867, which formed the government of Canada and many of our provinces and tells us how our government's supposed to run. So again, these two sections I've gotten from the Constitution Act of 1867. Section 35 over here is a bit different. It's newer. I've gotten that one from the Constitution Act of 1982. So there was a big amendment done in 1982, and I've gotten the provisions dealing with Aboriginal self-government from that one. Though you should know Aboriginal self-government goes much, much earlier than 1982. It's just what formalizes it, or what part of what formalizes it in our Constitution, actually. Not the only thing. So let's get going here. How do you know that the federal, or what the federal government is in charge of? Well, it's really easy. You just go to section 91 of the Constitution Act of 1867, which I've reproduced here. I've taken a few numbers out, like you could see here. There's no number 1, number 3, number 4, so I've kind of made it more manageable for us to look at. But basically, you'll just go up, and these are what the federal government is in charge of. So, for example, the federal government is in charge of trade and commerce. They're in charge of the postal service, and that's why we have these red boxes everywhere in our country that say Post Canada on them, and they don't say post of each province. It's a federal jurisdiction. Why? Because of section 91 sub 5, so 91(5). Why do we have the Canadian military rather than a military in each province? Well, there are many reasons, but the main one, the constitutional reason, is because section 91(7) says that we have a Canadian military, and there's no provision that we're going to see in the provinces that give the provinces the right to have a military. Other countries are different. For example, in the United States, the states are allowed having a state militia, and that's why they each have their National Guard in their own state, whereas in Canada we only have the federal government is in charge of our military. So that's because of this. And then you could go across all the other ones that they're in charge of. Another interesting one is the Criminal Code of Canada. Why don't we have a criminal code in each province like other countries do? Because section 91(27) says there's one criminal code in Canada, though it could be applied differently in each provinces. That we won't get into that, but there's one criminal code in Canada because section 91(27). So again, this list here is what the federal government's in charge of, so we could just write all that list over here. Now, let's go to the provinces. What are the provinces in charge of? Well, it's really well done in our Constitution. Section 91 is the federal government. Section 92 is the provincial government. So let's go through a few of these. They're in charge of the maintenance of hospitals, and that's why today the provincial governments are in charge of healthcare generally. Now, I forgot to add this. I should have put section 93, And Section 93 states that the provincial governments rather are in charge of all education. So that's why the education is a bit different in each province. So if you go in Quebec or in Ontario or in Alberta, the education systems are a bit different. That's because Section 93, which again I kind of forgot to put here, but Section 93 states that. Everything else is in Section 92. So, for example, another really interesting one is 16, which says the maintenance of local matters, basically. And that states that the provinces are in charge of things of a local nature, which makes sense. We don't want some faraway government in Ottawa to take care of things that are happening in each province. And that's why Section 92, sub 16, 92.16, says it's the provincial government in charge of. Now, this is where things change just a little bit. Well, what we should note is the Constitution clearly gives powers to the federal and clearly gives powers to the provincial governments through 91 and 92. The provincial government cannot tell the federal government what to do, and the federal government cannot tell the provincial government what to do. But there are some interesting aspects to that. So for example, nowhere here did you see the environment. So that's a hot button issue today. So the question is, who's in charge of the environment? Is it the provincial government or the federal government? Well, that brings up a lot of questions, and that's why we pay lawyers so much money, is to figure out these issues. So for example, one party could say, well, clearly the environment is a criminal law matter, and if you destroy the environment, you should be criminally liable. So clearly, if it's crime, it's 91, so the federal government's in charge of it. So therefore, the federal government's in charge of the environment. Well, another smart lawyer could say, actually, the environment, we all breathe the air and everything, so it's actually a health issue. So that's a provincial jurisdiction, 92.7. So the provinces should be in charge of it. Well, as you guess, when that happens, when the federal and provincial governments fight over who's in charge of what, and this happens all the time, they go to court to see who could be in charge of what issue. And that happens a lot, and that's a huge component of how our government works, is to figure out who's in charge of what. But generally, the municipal governments we would put over here. Now what's important to note is I've actually underlined this one, Section 92, again, the provinces are in charge of Section 92. It states, subsection 8, municipal institutions. So the province is actually in charge of everything that the municipalities do. And in fact, we've seen that the provinces could abolish municipalities or amalgamate them. They could put them together. They have complete autonomy to do with what they want with the municipal governments. So the municipal governments are not like the federal and provincial governments. They don't have their own inherent powers. The only thing they're in charge of are what the provinces let them be in charge of. And that's in some places more, in some places less, but they do not have their own powers. That's why I think it's better to put it under the provinces. And the final area is a very interesting area, and becoming more so, Aboriginal self-government agreements. Since, well, Aboriginals in Canada have been here before Europeans arrived, and since first contact, Aboriginals and Europeans have created many treaties. And this is going on until today. And these treaties give the Aboriginal self-government inherent jurisdiction. So they're kind of like a province or the federal government. And I've included some of those things here, like the Gaia Final Agreement, which was completed in 1999. And they're in charge of things like making their own laws. They're also in charge of taxation, so getting their own money, marriages, and post-secondary education. And like we've seen, provinces are generally in charge of education, but here we see Aboriginal governments are also in charge of education. So that changes a lot of how I think we should see, and I'm going to close this now, of how we should see how all these levels of government interact. The federal government's in charge of some things, of federal jurisdiction, Section 91, I'll put over here, Section 91. Provincial governments are in charge of other things, generally things in Section 92. The municipalities report directly to the provinces, so they're not in charge of anything. They're what we call creatures of the provinces. So they do whatever the provinces say. And finally, and this again is an increasingly important one, is Aboriginal self-government agreements have the power to do a lot of what the provinces, municipalities, and even sometimes what the federal government has to do. So it's becoming a really important level of government, Aboriginal self-government. So we're going to go into these in a bit more detail individually, but I hope that that was useful, and we'll look at it more in videos to come. Thanks a lot.